Good morning, everybody. How's it going? Welcome to Workforce Live. Everybody feeling alive? Maybe another cup of coffee over there? My name's Davey Nichols. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to tell you guys about HR analytics at Google. I've been at the company for over 7 years. I started off as an HR generalist, and I quickly moved over to the analytics team when I realized that we actually had one in the HR space. I was totally bowled over. I met with a statistician in the cafe one day, and I got to talking about some really nerdy economics principles. And before I knew it, I was in a new job in people analytics in this emerging space that at the time wasn't really defined. People didn't know what the point of HR analytics was. Why would you need to use data in the field of HR? After all, don't we have best practices? Isn't it already established what a good perf management process looks like? Don't we already know what employee well-being should sort of look and feel like? It was very controversial back then, but since then, I think that we've really taken off and really matured in a lot of ways. And today, what I'd like to do is to give you guys a little bit of a primer for what it's like to think like an analyst at Google. So, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that we use a framework to think about all the problems that we face on a given day-to-day basis. I'm talking about projects that might take several years to come to resolution on, or I'm talking about that crazy fire drill that you get from a senior vice president at 11 p.m. on a Friday night. Anybody been there before? So this process is called the People Analytics Value Chain. And it's a 6-step procedure that we use in the back of our minds whenever we're faced with a complex situation that we need to apply analytics to solve. Step 1 is gathering opinions. Step 2 is forming hypotheses. Step 3 is collecting the data. Step 4 is conducting the analysis. Step 5 is deriving the insights and sharing them. And step 6, the most important step, is actually bringing all the great material that you've provided with the analytics into action. So today, we're going to take a very real and poignant example, which is people management through that process, from step 1 to step 6. And I think it's important to everybody because we all, guess what, are direct reports of somebody, and we all have a manager, and we all have a boss. Unless anybody's self-employed or an entrepreneur, and then maybe we'll just kind of leave you off to the side for now. So since I'm an analyst, and since I like to collect data and analyze that data, I'd like to collect a little bit of data in the room right now. So let's start off. Please raise your hand if you've ever had an amazing manager in your career. Holy cow, it looks like basically everybody. That's awesome. Please raise your hand if you've ever had a horrible manager. It's pretty much an equal number. Third question. Raise your hand if you've ever been a horrible manager. A couple of brave souls over here. Congratulations. Thank you so much for being so courageous and honest. And the most important question, how many of you think that managers actually play an important role in a business? Okay. This should be a piece of cake. Everybody's on the same page as me. This is awesome. So why did I ask these questions? What are we trying to do with this? Well, what I'm trying to do is to suss out the opinions of the room on people's experiences with their managers. Who's had a great manager, who's had a poor manager, who's self-actualized and self-aware enough to know that they've struggled with management challenges, and most importantly, do managers actually matter? Are they actually important? And it seems like we have a pretty good consensus that that's actually the case. But at Google, that actually was not the case, surprisingly. I know it's very shocking. So let's move into our analytics value chain at step 1, which is gathering opinions on the business. When Google was founded in 1998 by Larry Page and Sergey Brin, they immediately had a very strong focus on really one thing when they were hiring people, and that was technical ability. They themselves were coming from these really advanced PhD programs. They had a strong belief that algorithms could solve all the problems of the world. Might sound a little bit familiar. And that's what they screened for when they were hiring people, was people's ability to knock it out of the park technically. So there was this prevailing belief that engineering managers were actually not adding a lot of value to the organization, that they actually were dead weight, that they were middle managers. And they were accused of adding hierarchy, they were accused of slowing down decision making, they were accused of not being able to hold their weight in discussions that were really technical and in depth. And the cardinal sin was that they simply didn't have the strong technical ability and pedigree that was expected of Google's leaders. So the very dramatic step was taken in July of 2001 to fire all managers at Google. It's pretty insane, right? We would never imagine doing that, hopefully at your companies. But that actually did happen. At the time, we were a startup, able to make quick and rapid decisions. And Larry and Sergey just decided that they wanted to get rid of engineering managers, and the next day they were gone. It's pretty startling. So that was one extreme of opinion. The other extreme of opinion was held by HR itself. At this time, it was a tiny little team of maybe 15 people, led by Stacy Sullivan, who was our first HR employee. She was hired as an HR director. She's now our chief culture officer and a vice president. But at this time, what do you think her main job was as an HR leader at Google, growing, doubling every year? Exactly, it was hiring. Nobody cared about anything else. Nobody was able to challenge these cultural status quo assumptions that managers were low import or not important at all. They were just trying to get butts in seats and trying to hire the best talent to fill these insane roles. So nobody actually tackled this problem. It just kind of stayed in stasis until around 2006, 2007, 2008, when we actually started to get a little bit focused on it and start to think about how the data could break some of these myths. So we've talked about step one, which is gathering opinions, sourcing them from the business, sourcing them from your clients. Step two, let's move into that. This is where we create our hypotheses and where we articulate statements that we want to test in a scientific way. So what are some of the hypotheses that we could come up with based on the raw material that I've already described, which is the business context at the time? There are several things. Number one, that the most important attribute of a manager is his or her technical ability. That's what Larry and Sergey thought, and so that's something we wanted to test. The second one was, what was the perspective of HR? And that was that managers actually did matter. Well, why did they matter? Well, it's because they supposedly were drivers of employee satisfaction and employee retention. And that was something that was believed to be true based on external research, but had never been validated or proven internally. And so nobody really cared, which is just how things are at Google. And the third point, which is one that I'm going to introduce, is that there was variance in the managers. We had some really amazing managers, we had some really poor managers, difficult to tell who they are, but we know that there's variation. And if anybody's an analyst in the room, you want variance because it makes doing analysis a heck of a lot easier. So that is our second step, which is deriving the hypotheses. What is our third step? Well, this is where we want to collect the data, source the data, and figure out what we have at our fingertips to be able to validate or disprove these hypotheses. So let's move into that phase, data. I can always tell who the analysts are in the audience when I talk about data, because eyes light up and people get really excited when I talk about Google's data is very clean. Any eyes getting excited? We have a lot of data. We are actually able to use production systems, the same systems that engineers use, which is absolutely unbelievable if you're an analyst. Another team actually administers our data warehouses and does all the reporting. So we just get to do analysis. How cool is that? So with this phase, the data, what data was available to us? There's actually several hundred sources of available data that we used for this study to try to prove whether managers mattered or not. This study, by the way, was called Project Oxygen. If you ever want to Google it, you can find the results very easily by using that internal code name that we had called it at the time. So I've said that we have a lot of data available to us. What data do we actually use to test these hypotheses that I'm describing? Well, it's quite complicated, but we can really boil it down just to two sets of data, and we can sort of plot those out. And you notice that I'm not using slides because I really want to focus on drawing this out for you as visually as possible, just live. The first is employee satisfaction, and this is based on a team composite score. So let's draw an imaginary vertical axis here, and this is employee satisfaction scores from our annual employee survey. This survey is called Google Geist. I'm sure, raise your hand if your company has an employee satisfaction survey. Okay, so half the room at least. So you know what I'm talking about. This is the sort of survey that asks about career development, about performance management, about innovation, about your intent to stay at a company, about your well-being, a whole host of themes. And it's something that we at Google send out to our employees, all of our employees, once a year. We're blessed with a phenomenally high response rate. People take this survey taking very seriously. They view it as part of their jobs to give this feedback. And they're very direct. Reading those comments, yeah, very direct. So anyway, back to the data. We're plotting the scores of the individual teams under individual managers on the y-axis here. So this obviously ranges from 0 to 100% favorable. Yes, we do have people who are 100% favorable. Last time I checked, nobody was 0%, but thank goodness. So what is the other axis? Well, let's use manager perf, manager's performance management scores. Raise your hand if your company has a performance management system. Keep your hands up if you actually have performance management scores or buckets or ratings or whatever you want to call them. Okay, so most of you know what I'm talking about here. This is a range of scores. Usually at the low end you have occasionally misses expectations or needs improvement or similar language. Then a step over you have something like meets expectations, consistently meets expectations, on target, whatever the case may be. Above that, you have exceeds expectations. Above that, you have strongly exceeds expectations. And then over here in this crazy area, you have people who walk on water. You have astounding performers. You have, like, you know, the next Bill Gates, the next Larry Page, Jeff Bezos, whoever. So these two axes, you can visualize this field. We have team satisfaction scores and we have manager performance scores. So you can plot every single manager in the company based on those two scores. That's your X and your Y points. What's interesting is if you take the median score of those Googler satisfaction scores on the team basis and the median score for the manager's performance, you can draw a straight line up and a straight line over, and you've neatly carved out this into 4 quadrants, or a 2x2 matrix. Everybody understanding? Everybody following so far? Okay, I see heads nodding, so I'm not getting too technical. So 2x2, in the upper right, that is where you have your target population, where you want everybody to be, but not everybody is. These are high scorers, people who have phenomenally high scores from their teams on their employee satisfaction, and where the manager is also doing a phenomenal job at performing. So that's where you want everyone to be. That is your outlying population that you want to target, and that's also the outcome variable that we'll talk about in a second when we get to the analysis. Conversely, on this other, if you go diagonally down, you have people who scored lower on their team satisfaction. You have managers who are struggling with their own performance. This is also an interesting population for us because by sussing out what's going on with the behavior undergirding this group, we're able to prevent people from being in that bucket, or we're able to predict who will be suffering from low performance and help move those people ideally up into the higher bucket. Is this making sense so far, these 2 quadrants? Okay, I see some heads nodding. Now, there are obviously 2 other quadrants that we're not talking about just for the sake of time, but those are also interesting, and we can do follow-up analyses if we wanted to sort of suss those out. So I've talked about 2 major sets of data, employee satisfaction scores and manager performance scores. Is this enough data for us to be able to say with authority what causes somebody to be a good manager or what causes somebody to be a poor manager? Okay. I'm seeing some shaking heads, which is good. No, this is not enough data. What we have so far is mostly descriptive statistics, and we have outcome variables for whether somebody ended up in the high bucket or somebody ended up in the low bucket. But we don't actually know what's going on with these people yet. We have to collect more data. So we get out our handy clipboards, we come up with 15 very neutral questions, and we actually ask a random set of folks from each of those 2 buckets about their management practices, about what their actual behavior is as managers. And note that we did this in a double-blind fashion. So what does double-blind mean? Why would we use that? It means that we didn't know whether those people were high-scoring managers or low-scoring managers. And the point of that is we didn't want to walk in with this preconceived notion of, oh, this person's a superstar, let's, we'll filter that through our own, sort of analysis on, like, this person's amazing or this person sucks. We wanted to be completely neutral about it so that we would collect the data in an objective fashion as possible. So after that, we compiled all of our clipboards, we typed out all the notes, and we had 400 or 500 pages of single-space 8-point font data. So it was my job, and a couple of other people's jobs, to read through all of those comments, to comment code them, to extract themes, and to derive some insights about what was actually going on with this. And it's very easy to create literally dozens of scales and dozens of measures that you can sort of look for when you're going through the comments to confirm whether, yes, this person seemed to indicate that communicating effectively was important, or no, this person didn't seem to indicate that communicating effectively was important. So I've talked about several sources of data. We've talked about manager performance scores. We've talked about their team satisfaction scores. We've talked about all this qualitative data. What actually happened with the analysis? Let's move on to that phase. I won't get super technical with this, but we used a variety of regression techniques. Anybody here know what a binary logistic regression is? Can you explain it to me? No, I'm just kidding. No, just kidding. We used a lot of really interesting techniques. Most of them were kind of things that you probably saw in your stats textbooks in college, very basic statistics. Others were much more robust. And one thing that's really amazing about working at Google is that you can actually talk to stats experts in other functions. So quantitative marketing, we have an amazing economics team. These people have PhDs in statistics. Many of them are actually professors, so you can consult with them for free very easily about what technique you should use, which makes our jobs a heck of a lot easier. So it's pretty awesome. So we ran this analysis, step 4. What were the insights? Let's move into step 5. What actually came out of this? Once we'd done all these regressions, what spilled out as being predictive as actually being important? Well, there were actually 8 manager traits that were deemed to be highly predictive of people ending up in that upper right bucket, which is the high-performing managers, high-scoring managers. So what were those 8 things? And what was the most important one? Well, the most important one was to be a good coach. This is probably obvious to any of you who've ever managed people before or who've ever been managed, which is basically everybody in the room, that you want somebody who's patient. You want somebody who will provide a gentle explanation about something. You want somebody who will give live feedback after, say, a presentation or after an important meeting or after you've run an analysis or after you've made a mistake. How do you recover from this? How do you pivot and continue along and continue to have high performance? So being a good coach was an incredibly important attribute. It was the #1 driver, #1 predictor of ending up in that top bucket. We don't have a ton of time, so I won't go through the full list of 8 attributes, but there's this amazing tool called Google that you can use. You just type in Project Oxygen, or you type in Building a Better Boss. There was a New York Times article a couple of years ago that specifically sussed out what the 8 attributes were. What's interesting about that article, too, is it also talks about what predicts being a poor manager, or what are some of the predictive factors there. And just to give you a flavor of some of that, it's going through a difficult time of change. Maybe some of you have gone through a reorganization before where management is kind of shifted around or somebody important leaves and the team is left scrambling to sort of replace that person. That's something that causes a lot of people to struggle. Another is somebody being promoted a little bit too quickly, being given a huge level of responsibility without actually having the credibility in the organization, without having the skill set, without having the relationships. That can be something that can lead people to kind of be in a trouble spot. And another is just certain types of personalities, people who tend to be really aggressive or really domineering, people who want to steal credit and don't want to give it to their teams, people who don't give recognition to hard work that's going on in their organizations, et cetera. All those things are big pitfalls to avoid if you want to be a good manager. So I want to end with the last step, which is the most important step, which is taking action. How do we actually take action with these great insights? Well, Googlers love their data. They're addicted to it. So we created a diagnostic instrument called the Upward Feedback Survey, or UFS. And this goes out to all Googlers in the company. They answer 15 questions about their manager, and that is converted into a composite score on manager effectiveness. And then those reports are shared out with every manager who had a sufficient end count of responses. So this means that I, as a manager, would receive a report from my direct reports about how I'm doing on coaching, about how I'm communicating effectively on the team goals, et cetera. And it's like Christmas because you're like waiting to get the gift of the feedback. It's also like Halloween because it can be a little scary. But we always value the feedback that we get from our reports, and so it's incredibly part of the culture. The last thing is that we have an institution now called GMA, or Great Manager Award. It goes out to 25 or 30 people every year across the entire company, and these people are flown to amazing locations around the world where they get to just chill on a beach, and they also get to meet other people who are high-performing managers from other functions, and then those people then come back to Google and coach people who might be struggling or who might need a little bit of coaching or who might be new managers. So it's created this self-sustaining ecosystem where we measure regularly and where we hold people accountable for improving their management experience. And like I said, just Google Project Oxygen or Building a Better Boss if you want the full list of 8 attributes. And I'm happy to answer any questions during the breaks. Thank you.